another video, and today I'm going to be talking about conditional dropdowns. This video is going to be a little more advanced than some of the previous videos that we've created. However, this is one of the main functions in Excel that we use regularly for many different reasons. These things stretch from using them for form selections and various other sort of Excel inputs. So let's crack on. The structure of creating a conditional drop-down menu consists of 5 different formulas. So we'll be using the indirect formula, the concatenate, depending on which version of Excel you're using, address, match, and Countif. And the combination of these 5 put together basically creates the ability to have a conditional drop-down menu created. So, for example, I have this first drop-down menu here, where I can select my favorite color, and then my second drop-down uses the criteria of what was selected here to give you options to select. Okay, and obviously you can have these continuing on. So that's favorite color, first car, and that changes to a car selection. Where do you live? And again, that changes to a country selection. So you could, in theory, have multiple different drop-downs, all conditional against each other. So your inputs become a little bit more locked down, do not require someone to type free-field text in there and then cause issues with your data verification later on. Okay, so in order to create one of these drop-down menus, first of all, you have to have some kind of lookup data. Okay, so I've created a little mini table here, and I've got menu 1 as the first column, menu 2 as the second column. You could have menu 3, menu 4, and so forth. Right, so I've then just created a favorite color, red, green, blue, first car, Audi, BMW, Mini, and you see how I've just duplicated these across here, and that's important. So in terms of any sort of main kind of table structure, database table structure, etc., you want to make sure that you're duplicating out this criteria where you have different data in your other fields, right? And you might have a unique identifier in sense of somewhere else in your data table. But for this example, keeping it quite basic, so for every different color I have the same menu selection of favorite color. For every different make of car, I have the first car selection, and then for a selection of countries, where do you live? Okay, then I created the first lookup, and this first lookup basically is each unique version of menu 1. Okay, and there's lots of different ways you can easily do that. If you've got a large data set, you can just create a pivot table, select column A, click OK. No, I don't want to put it there, let's just put it here. So pivot table, selection of A, in that pivot table put your menus here, and then you can just copy out your selections, paste those as values into here, and then you can delete your pivot table. And it's as simple as that. If you've got a large data selection, for my purposes in this example, could have just typed out those 3 answers without a problem. Then the very first drop-down menu that you have, you create it off of this little mini table. So you go to your data tab, go to data verification here, and you create a list based on your menu 1 data. Okay. this then gives you a starting point, which means this lookup has to refer to your selection within your first drop-down menu. Okay. This formula consists of these 5 functions, and to start with, I've kind of just wrote it all out at the bottom here, and to kind of give you guys an idea of how we're going to structure this. So the first piece of information that you're going to require is to know what sheet is the data in. Okay, so in this case it's our lookups table, right? Lookup sheet. Now, it's important that you look at how Excel treats your sheet. So for example, I have lookups exclamation point, right? And that is because if you go to a different sheet like this one here, and you just go to reference something within your lookups, and press enter here, this is how it would appear. Okay, lookups, exclamation point, and then whatever the cell there you clicked on, right, to reference and bring it back in. However, there's a couple of things to note. If this tab name consisted of 2 words, like this, now our reference, our sheet reference has changed a little. It now has a single quotation at the beginning of the sheet name and just before that exclamation point. Now that only ever happens when you have multiple words in your tab name, right? So I don't need that for my example. If I did, then I would have had to have included it in here, right? So we could have put a single quotation there and a single quotation there, and it's on the wrong side, sorry, my bad. Single quotation there, right? So if it had multiple words, quotation, single quotation at the beginning, and a quotation just between the last word and the single, exclamation point. Now, having those single quotations works for singular words as well as 2 or more words within your sheet name. So it will still work with them, but it wouldn't work without them if you had multiple words, if that makes sense. So for now I'll leave that in there, and it should still work, still working perfectly fine there. So that's your first thing that you're going to need, and the reason that you're going to need that is usually your lookup values for your drop-down menus are going to be held in a different sheet, sometimes a different workbook, than your actual input table, right, or your forms that you're using these conditional drop-downs for. So you're going to need this as the first part of the formula. The second part that you're going to need to work out is how to use the match function. Okay, so the match function in essence always brings back the first row where your first drop down was selected, right? So this match function will find your unique identifier within a data source of some kind. I've just selected column A, so everything in column A will find what row number, where do you live sits, right? So this first selection we can see is in row 8. So you look down here and you say, yep, sure enough, it's found the first match of that record in row 8. Okay, so the match function is quite simple. What we're doing here is we are looking up our first drop-down value within column A, which is all of our menu 1 options, and then we're saying we want it to be an exact match. There's no fancy way to really explain it. It is literally just, it's going to go down every single row until it finds that piece of information, right? So that first selection here, where do you live, all the way down here, it'll find it in row 8. It's always the first one it finds, so it won't find number 9, it won't find 10, it won't find 11, it'll say, right, working from row 1 down, what's the first row that has that data? So in this case, it's row 8, which is perfect, this is what we want. Okay, so that gets you the first row. Then you're going to need the last row. that it sits in, right? And the last row is slightly more complex because you want to know how many records there are in your data source. So we're going to use a Countif for that. But then also we want to know the starting position, which was row 8 within our first row, right? So it's row 8 plus however many records there are minus 1. And the reason that you would minus 1 will be that you'll want to remove that first record that gets found. And it gives you a true count of how many options you're then going to have. Okay, so to start with, let's look at the Countif formula. So anyone who's not familiar with Countif, it's quite basic. It has two parts. One is the range in which you want to count, and the second is the criteria. Right, so in our scenario here, we select all of column A, and we say count however many there are with a text that says where do you live. Okay, so in this particular case, we have 4 options, it finds 4. Right, now at the beginning of this, however, we want to sum or plus 2 things together. We want to know, okay, because ultimately our end goal is the last row, right? And if we were in VBA, we could just do Excel up and would be fine, would find it, not a problem. But because we're talking about using formulas and we're trying to make conditional formatting, conditional drop-downs, we need to have a slightly different approach. So the first thing we need to do is we take the first row, so row 8, and then we're going to plus however many there are in our count, so we're going to plus 4, that gets us to 12. Now in this scenario we're double counting row 8, okay, because we've counted it within our Countif, we've counted 4 records, and then we've also dropped straight down here to row 8. So we've double counted row 8, right? So we minus the 1 at the end, and then that gives us a true last row in which that data sits. So we have a first row of 8 and a last row of 11. Now the other thing to bear in mind is you can't break this apart, so you couldn't insert a row here, it will still think it's 11 even though it's actually 12. So you need to make sure you treat this lookup table as like a true database sense, right? So you can't have broken records, broken lines, and always try to sort it by menu 1, right? It ultimately doesn't matter what order these are in. If you want them alphabetically though, it's usually beneficial, but you'd always want to sort these to make sure these are grouped together, and then this formula here will always find the last row where that data sits. Okay, so far we have the sheet where the data is held, we have the first row where our lookup values are going to be, and we have the last row where the lookup values are going to be. Now the next part, or next 2 parts, is using the address formula. Okay, the address formula basically then brings back the A1 reference point of your rows, okay, and columns. So if we have a look at this formula, it's relatively basic. It has 2 parts. Other parts are optional, so we could say we want absolute numbers, we want an A1 referencing, and so forth, but a lot of this stuff is actually by default how we want it, so we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to say 2 parts, keep it simple. The first part is the row number, so we have that here, right? So row 8, so we're just going to select that cell, and then the column number. So much like a VLOOKUP, you'd count how many columns there are in your table and which number or which column do you want to actually index and bring back, right? So I've typed in 2, as in I want column B, so 1, 2, and it's column B. Now what this address formula does is it then basically brings back the A1 reference for row 8, column 2, which would be B8, okay? And of course the address part 2 uses the same formula, but this time we're using the last row and we're using the second column, so that comes back as B11. So far we have the sheet that contains the data, the first row, the last row. We can have what that looks like in terms of an address, at first row address, last row address. The next part is then to actually bring all that together as a text string. Okay, so we use the Concatenate Formula that basically then brings back the sheet with the data, the address, part 1. We then put this in between address part 1 and then part 2. And what this does is it basically mimics how Excel treats a range of cells. So for example, if I wanted to look at all of this information here, obviously it's not going to work as a formula, we have this just in between those two references. So it's I13 to I17, and it's best to, that's basically just how Excel kind of bridges the gap, right? It says it's everything between 13 and 17. So what we're doing within our formula is basically mimicking that. So we're concatenating, or making a text string from our lookup sheet with our first part of address. We're then showing Excel that we want to make it everything from address part 1 to address part 2. Okay, and then how that looks is like this. Okay, so we have lookups, explanation point, B8 to B11. Okay, and obviously we have the dollar signs in there just to kind of make sure that it's completely anchored in. Although it's not 100% actually necessary for what we're doing on this purpose, I do just find it best practice to do that. Right, so now you have a text string, you can create an indirect formula. And what the indirect formula does is it treats your text string as if it were a cell reference or referring to another part of a workbook, a totally different workbook. It basically allows you to dynamically create formulas from text. So it's probably a little bit harder to explain than it is to actually see it. So basically the way indirect works is you type in indirect and then you put in place the text string, right? So that concatenated text string of where we're looking, which is our sheet, address part 1 and address part 2, and then the true at the end here is that we have to tell the indirect formula that it's an A1 reference, meaning we're using the column letters and row numbers rather than the RC method, the R1C1 method, right? So always use true. It's just generally a little bit easier because you can visualize how it's going to work within your document, because you can see the letters and you can see the numbers and you don't have to worry about it all too much. Now by default this formula will not actually work within here, because what you're basically doing is saying, like I did this earlier, a whole range of SKUs, right? A whole range of data all within one cell. So obviously it's going to find just the first one in this scenario, but this formula here has quite a few dynamic and moving parts. It won't work directly in a single cell. So now you have to create, you can take this entire formula and you can put it into our data verification, right? So if I just create a new one, data verification here, we would select a list and then we would paste in, if I actually copied it, here, so we'll just copy that and we'll go to data verification from a list, and then paste that into there, and then we end up with our dynamic drop-down. Now, that's all well and good, except this formula is very messy. Okay, it basically has all of these parts spelt out independently, when in reality what you'd want to do is actually now take each of these elements and then build it up into a single formula, which is this one just here. So the way that this looks is concatenate the lookups, so our sheet name, right? And we can put in those additional single quotation marks just there, just for safety. Our address match F2 in column A, an exact match, and our address is for column B. That's your address part 1. Address part 2 is our match F2 in A, 0 is an exact match, plus our countif, count everything that's in column A, where it matches our drop down 1 option, minus 1 to remove that double count, and then in column B. And this basically then makes the formula look like this, which is lookups B8 to B11. If I just expand that a little bit, there we go. Now, all that's left to do at that point is to wrap that inside the indirect formula. So this is how your last formula would actually look. Okay, so it's indirect, concatenate the sheet name, address part 1, address part 2, and that is all. Now we can come in here, we can go to our data verification, which is in the data tab. Data verification, we want to create a list, and then we want to paste in the formula. It's quite long, but just click OK, and now we have a drop down menu that is that is conditional based on the selection of our first drop down. Okay. Now, obviously, this is quite a basic example. It's not exactly a complex version of it, but obviously you can create a similar scenario in here, right? So, for example, I have all of this sales data, and I have a list of categories, and let's say I wanted to bring back every product that was inside one of these as a drop-down menu. Select one and then bring back the total sales, right? So let's say this is my starting point. The first thing I want to do is create a drop-down menu for a list of those categories. So we click here, we go to our sales data, and we'll select that list of categories. Okay, so now my first drop-down menu is there. Now my second drop-down menu, if I create this correctly, we want to, I'll use the concat rather than concatenate in this scenario. We want to concatenate. We're going to open up some quotations, and we're going to type that first with a single quotation, and then sales, single quotation, explanation point, and then we're going to want to close off a double quotations. Now we'll create the address, okay, and then we'll open that bracket. Our row number is our match of our first drop down within our sales data in column A. Now I want to bring back the descriptions, so we'll just make that an exact match. Right, so my column will become 3 because I want column C. Okay, And then I'm not going to worry about absolute numbers A1 referencing at this point, so I'm just going to close that bracket. We'll do a comma for our third piece of text. We'll open up the quotations, colon, close quotations, and then another comma. Now we'll do the next address, open up bracket. We want a row number. Now our row number this time is the same as before. We're going to match A2, which is our first drop-down menu, in our column of A within our data source. We're going to make it an exact match, and then we're going to plus a count if the range is again column A, and our criteria is A2. Close that off, and then we're going to -1 to remove that double counting issue. Okay, now that becomes your text string for your first drop down, and then I'm just going to wrap that in an indirect formula, and then I'm going to close off the concatenate. I totally forgot about that, and then I'm going to make it an A1 rather than R1C1. We want A1 because A1 just makes it easier to understand and read. Okay, so we're going to do that, and close the bracket, press enter, and go into 2. Feel like it's okay. Let's see where I went wrong. Okay, so what I've done here is I've actually missed off the part where I needed to add in what column number I want, which is 3. That is the entire concatenation, so I can do that, and now I can wrap that in an indirect formula and close that off. Now this formula here, I can copy it, go into my data tab, data verification, we want a list, and then we can paste that into there, press OK, and now I have a list of products. It's quite a lengthy list for everything that is in our advent. Okay, now I can change to animation, and I have a list of animation. I can change this to let's say Christmas pets, and now I have a load of pet products just in here. Doesn't really mean a lot to me, but bunch of Christmas product. We can have a look at Christmas candles, and now we have a variety range. It's a long list of Christmas candle product, all in here. We can have a look at some tinsel, which I think is actually a smaller list. I thought it was a smaller list, a little bit smaller, and so forth. So that's how you create a conditional drop down. It's you can use it at a small scale like this. You can use it within a large data set like this, and then once you have it, you can, so let's choose this tinsel here. We can now create something like a some ifs actually. Some ifs. Our sum range within column A is going to be our total sales. Our criteria range is our description. Go back to our original sheet. Our criteria is going to be the product name. We'll close that off, and now I can bring in total sales for every single selection dynamically, just like this. Okay, and that is one way of kind of controlling potential issues that you may have with data verification issues. So if you had like a huge form that needed to be populated, and you wanted to make sure that people used the correct terminology before you, say, upload it into a database, and then you can create formulas that run off of the selection criteria that they have, you'll be able to basically almost create a master data solution where you can prevent people from having short-coded words, for example, where you wouldn't want them to necessarily have that kind of data. So conditional drop-down menus, highly recommend it. I know they've got a lot of moving parts to them, but I strongly recommend, if you don't already know these 5 formulas, that you learn them and you start messing around with trying to create some conditional formatting, some conditional drop-down menus. And I hope you liked the video. I know it's quite a long one, a lot more in-depth and advanced than maybe some people are comfortable with. But once you start using it, it does make it makes the whole Excel experience a little bit easier, and you'll be creating much more effective documents out of it. Appreciate it if you like the video, you would smash that like button, and if you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Cheers.